don't go too far, as we will be back with you very shortly. In a developing incident on February the 25th, Cuban forces reportedly killed 4 people and wounded 6 others, all of whom were aboard a Florida-registered speedboat that entered Cuban waters and opened fire on a Cuban patrol. According to the Cuban government, the group aboard the boat consisted of anti-government Cubans, and some of them were even previously wanted in Cuba. They came from the United States, allegedly armed with assault rifles, handguns, homemade explosives, ballistic vests, and telescopic sights. The Cuban Interior Ministry has confirmed that an additional Cuban suspect was also detained in connection with the plot. According to initial statements collected from the detainees, the authorities have stated that the group's intention was to infiltrate Cuba for terrorist purposes. The wounded individuals were evacuated and are currently receiving medical care. Among the casualties, was identified as Michael Ortega Casanova, while the other 3 remain unnamed. Now, let's move to reactions from US officials. US Vice President J.D. Vance has expressed the situation, acknowledging that it is being closely monitored. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has provided an update, confirming that the Department of Homeland Security and Coast Guards are involved in the investigation. Let's listen in to their statements.
So on the second thing, Marco briefed me about 15 minutes ago on it, but we don't know a whole lot of details, and so I'll defer to the White House to provide more updates as we get them. Certainly, a situation that we're monitoring. Hopefully, it's not as bad as we fear it could be, but can't say more because I just don't know more.
As it stands now, the Department of Homeland Security, the Coast Guard, others are involved. The majority of the information we still possess is what Cuban authorities are providing, both the public and the U.S. government. We have our embassy on the ground in Havana working this as we speak, asking for access to the people that were on those vessels, if they were American citizens or permanent residents. According to the Cuban regime, that the boat was registered in Florida. We're tracking that down. We will know shortly, and we will know quickly, many more facts about this incident than we know right now. The majority of the facts being publicly reported are those by the information provided by the Cubans. We will verify that independently, and as we gather more information, then we'll be prepared to respond accordingly.
Moreover, in Florida, Attorney General James Uthmere has ordered state prosecutors to open a separate investigation into the incident, expressing skepticism and the Cuban government's account. We're now being joined by Dr. Satoru Nagao, who's a fellow Hudson Institute, joining us from Hudson, Washington. Thank you so much for joining us here today on NewsX World. What are the potential diplomatic and security ramifications as for US-Cuba relations, especially given the current climate of sanctions, geopolitical tension and historical mistrust between the 2 countries?
But this is important because for a long time, Cuba is a major country to register U.S. influence in the Caribbean Sea and in the American continent. So that's why the Cuba's intelligence connection or the Cuba's security person's presence in this region is one of the threats against the U.S. hegemony in this American continent. But now the Cuba-Venezuela agreement has disrupted. Indeed, Cuba does not have money to buy oil, but in this case, Cuba can provide a security person or the medical staff. So that's why the Venezuela provide oil. It was a deal between 2 countries, and so that's why Cuba can survive. But now Venezuela was fallen, and Cuba lost a partner to deal, the barter-based deal. So that's why Cuba faced a crisis And Cuba tried to rely on the Mexico, but Mexico also cannot help the Cuba. So that's why the just current oil sanctions is very severe for Cuba's economy. And so now the people need to, people face a very serious shortage of the energy. Only some hours per day they can get electronic power. So that's why without Cuba follow the United States, it is very decisive for Cuba, and revolution or something could happen in the long run.
And what broader questions does this incident raise about broader security, maritime law, and the risks of non-state or irregular actors engaging in armed movements across international waters?
Indeed, this economic sanction is very tough because anyway, the source of the oil is Venezuela. And now Venezuela will not export oil to Cuba. So that's why the blockade itself could happen, but that is not so tight. But anyway, the source of this oil has already closed. And there is no other country to provide the oil instead of Venezuela, because providing the oil means that this is challenging against the United States. And so it is a clear challenge, means that the U.S. will react against these countries. Of course, the tariff is one of the things, but other things also could happen. So that's why it is not easy to do. And geographically, this is the area of the United States, very close proximity and relatively easy to deploy. So that's why countries around Cuba cannot ignore this America's intervention's possibility. So that's why this sanction is very strong now.
Thank you, Dr. Satoru Nagao, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Thank you. Tensions over Cuba's worsening crisis escalated as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stated that Cuba must change drastically to curb mass emigration and improve living conditions. Rubio has blamed the communist leadership for policies that have left the island vulnerable to an energy crisis and worsening humanitarian conditions. Rubio also warned that the US could reinstate restrictions on Venezuelan oil imports to Cuba if Havana violates the spirit of recent US sanctions easing. This highlights Washington's determination to maintain pressure on Cuba even as the US Treasury allows limited sales of Venezuelan oil to Cuba's private sector, excluding government and military entities. However, regardless of these measures, Cuba continues to face severe energy shortages and economic hardship, with power cuts and soaring costs intensifying migration. Meanwhile, regional leaders and humanitarian organizations urge dialogue and assistance to address the deepening crisis, but the US remains firm in its stance, increasing pressure on Cuba's government. We're now being rejoined by Adrian Calamel, who is a fellow Arabian Peninsula Institute and terrorism scholar. Thank you for joining us back here, Adrian, on NewsX World. Does linking potential retightened oil sanctions to Cuba's behaviour risk punishing ordinary citizens, or is it necessary diplomatic lever?
If it's done correctly, it's absolutely a diplomatic lever that can be used. And the Trump administration, I think, has been very mindful as I stated out with the Islamic Republic and how they levy sanctions. And then as Dr. Nagao rightly pointed out, this is, there is oil going into the country, but it's only going in the private sector. It's just how is it monitored? So it's a little, a little bit fog of sanctions, fog of war. I mean, this is a conflict, a cold conflict, sometimes turning a little hot at times, especially Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs type scenarios, and it's only 90 miles off the coast of America. So yes, Venezuela coming offline, that really impacts Cuba. Now all they have for support is China's important for them. Cuba's important for the Chinese. They basically took an old Russian spy base, revamped it, and they're using it as a forward operating spy base 90 miles off the coast. And then it's also been, there's been visits by top officials such as Mohsen Rezai of the Islamic Republic in Cuba right around 2022. So that could change with Venezuela situation, because Iran was part of that illicit oil network, and they now it just may be two-way trade between Iran and China. Is it going to hurt the people? I really hope not, but at the end of the day, it's this government that's been really hurting this people for decades upon decades. And Marco Rubio knows best, since his family fled Cuba. So, we'll see what happens. I'm generally not in favor of sanctions, because a lot of times they just hurt the people, or they're not effective because they're just not enforced. I hope that we are going about it the right way this time around.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hong Kong's Court of Appeal has overturned Jimmy Lay's fraud conviction. The ruling came